In the spring of 1944, along the muddy roads of the Italian front, American infantrymen faced a problem that no amount of official doctrine could solve. German reconnaissance vehicles prowled their positions with near impunity, calling in artillery fire that caused significant disruption along the front lines. The approved methods for stopping these armored scout cars required equipment that simply didn't exist at the front lines. This video is presented for historical and educational purposes only. Then a young corporal from Indiana, a man who'd spent his teenage years fixing broken rail equipment with scrap metal and wire, decided that if the Army wouldn't provide a solution, he'd create one himself. The wire obstacle method contributed to a substantial reduction in casualties across 3 divisions, spread through whispered conversations between soldiers, and eventually forced the United States Army to quietly rewrite its field manuals, all while remaining completely unauthorized for months. This is the story of an improvised defense that military doctrine said couldn't work, but battlefield reality proved otherwise. By early 1944, the Allied campaign in Italy had become a grinding war of attrition. The 34th Infantry Division, composed largely of National Guard units from the Midwest, had been fighting its way up the Italian peninsula since the previous autumn. Progress was measured in yards, and every village, every river crossing, every ridgeline came at a heavy cost. The terrain favored defense. German forces held the high ground, and they used it expertly. But beyond the static defensive positions, the Wehrmacht employed a reconnaissance strategy that proved devastatingly effective. Light armored vehicles, primarily the Sonderkraft Fahrzeug 222, a 4-wheeled reconnaissance car, conducted daily patrols along American front lines. These scout cars were purpose-built for their mission. Open-topped but armored against small arms fire and a machine gun, they could navigate mountain roads that heavier tanks couldn't access. More importantly, they were fast. A crew could observe American positions, mark concentrations of troops or equipment, and withdraw before any effective response could be organized. The intelligence they gathered fed directly into German artillery batteries. A scout car patrol at dawn often meant a barrage by midday. Soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive engine sound of an approaching 222 and knew that their position had likely just been compromised. American doctrine provided clear guidance on countering reconnaissance vehicles. Engage with anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or deploy mines along approach routes. In theory, this was sound tactical thinking. In practice, it was useless. The 34th Division possessed 9 bazookas for approximately 15,000 men. Anti-tank rifles had been phased out of the inventory the previous year. Mines were reserved for prepared defensive positions, not for the fluid front lines where units moved frequently and roads changed hands daily. So the scout cars continued their patrols, and the pressure on American frontline units steadily increased. February 1944 was particularly brutal. These weren't losses from major engagements or assaults on fortified positions. These were soldiers neutralized in their foxholes at observation posts during routine patrols, stopped because a scout car had spotted them and radioed their location. The pattern was grimly consistent. A 222 would appear at dawn or dusk, moving quickly along roads that paralleled American positions. Soldiers would engage with rifle fire, which sparked harmlessly off the armor. The scout car would return fire, then withdraw before heavier weapons could be brought to bear. Hours later, German artillery would blanket the area. March brought no improvement. The reconnaissance patrols became bolder, sometimes moving directly through American positions without stopping. Soldiers tried throwing grenades, but the scout cars moved too fast for accurate throws. They tried concentrated rifle fire aimed at the open commander's hatch, but hitting a moving target from a foxhole proved nearly impossible. Officers reported the problem up the chain of command. The response was consistent: maintain defensive discipline, conserve anti-tank assets, await resupply. Higher headquarters acknowledged the reconnaissance problem, but offered no practical solutions. James Dalton grew up in Gary, Indiana during the Depression. His father worked 15-hour shifts in the blast furnaces at U.S. Steel, and the family lived in a neighborhood where factory whistles marked time more reliably than clocks. Young Jimmy was the middle child among 6 siblings, neither old enough to work full-time nor young enough to avoid responsibility. He spent his adolescent years at the rail yards. While other boys were in school or playing, Dalton learned the mechanics of freight trains, which couplings failed most often, how to identify a worn cable before it snapped, which temporary repairs would hold, and which would fail catastrophically. The railroad taught practical problem solving. Equipment broke constantly, and the company rarely replaced anything that could be patched together. Dalton learned to improvise repairs using whatever materials were at hand: wire, rope, scrap metal, and creativity. He learned to assess a problem quickly, identify the minimum intervention needed, and implement it before the next train came through. More importantly, he learned to think in terms of cascading failures. A small defect in one component could lead to disaster elsewhere in the system. Prevention was always cheaper than response. At 17, he was working as a switchman apprentice. The job required constant vigilance and the ability to predict mechanical behavior under stress. You learned what would hold and what would break, often by watching others make mistakes you couldn't afford to repeat. He enlisted in January 1943. 3 months after his 19th birthday, the Army promised training and steady pay. What Dalton received was 8 weeks of basic infantry instruction and a rifle he'd barely qualified with before being shipped to North Africa. By September 1943, he was in Italy. The rail yard skills that had seemed useless in basic training suddenly became relevant again. The Army ran on logistics and mechanical systems, and those systems broke constantly under combat conditions. The German 222 Scout car represented a nearly perfect reconnaissance vehicle for the Italian terrain. Its 4-wheel drive system provided excellent mobility on mountain roads. The armor, while thin by tank standards, was sufficient to defeat rifle-caliber ammunition. The 20 mm autocannon gave it firepower beyond its weight class. But the real advantage was doctrinal. German reconnaissance units understood their mission: observe, report, and withdraw. They didn't seek prolonged engagements. A typical patrol lasted 15 to 20 minutes, covering several miles of frontline positions before returning to friendly territory with valuable intelligence. American forces had no effective counter at the squad or platoon level. A bazooka team could destroy a 222, but bazookas were scarce, and the rockets even scarcer. Commanders hoarded anti-tank weapons for use against Panthers and Tigers, not for engaging light reconnaissance vehicles. This created a tactical gap. Infantry companies could defend against enemy infantry effectively. They could call in artillery support against fixed positions. But they couldn't stop fast-moving scout cars from mapping their positions and directing fire onto them. The psychological effect was significant. Soldiers developed a sense of helplessness. You could dig the perfect fighting position, maintain excellent camouflage discipline, and follow every tactical procedure correctly. Yet a scout car could still spot you and call in artillery that would stop you hours later. Veterans developed a bitter saying, "You can't shoot what you can't hit, and you can't hit what moves too fast." On March 10, 1944, after another day that saw additional losses caused by a scout car patrol, Dalton made a decision. He would implement a solution that he'd been considering for weeks, a solution that directly violated his company commander's explicit orders. The concept was simple. German scout cars used predictable routes. They moved quickly, but speed requires smooth surfaces, which meant they stayed on roads. If you could place an obstacle across a road at precisely the right height to catch a vehicle's front axle, the car's own momentum would do the rest. Dalton had watched a scout car flip during an unrelated incident weeks earlier. When it struck a log partially buried in a road, the vehicle had tumbled violently. That observation, combined with his railroad experience with derailments caused by track obstructions, suggested a possible approach. He needed wire strong enough to withstand impact, but flexible enough to wrap around anchor points. He needed anchors that could be driven into soft ground, but would hold against sudden tension. And he needed a height that would catch an axle without being visible to an approaching vehicle. Shortly after midnight, Dalton gathered materials from the supply dump, 30 feet of rusted barbed wire, already in the inventory for defensive obstacles, 2 standard-issue entrenching tools, the folding shovels every soldier carried. He moved alone toward a section of road the Germans used regularly for patrols. Working in darkness, with German positions less than a half-mile away, he drove the first shovel into the mud on the left side of the road. The blade sank 6 inches initially, which wouldn't hold under tension. He used a rock to hammer it deeper until it was stable at 12 inches. The second shovel went in on the opposite side, 18 feet across. He'd measured this distance based on the typical width of a 222's wheelbase. Then came the critical part, the wire height. Too high, and it would be visible, or miss the axle entirely. Too low, and the wheels would roll over it. Dalton had examined a destroyed 222 during a previous patrol and had estimated the front axle height at approximately 14 inches. He strung the wire at exactly that height, wrapping it tightly around each shovel handle with multiple loops. The tension had to be precise, loose enough to have some give during initial contact, tight enough to hold against the momentum of a moving vehicle. After 20 minutes of adjustment, the wire hummed when plucked, like a guitar string. The shovels held firm. Dalton covered the wire with a thin layer of mud for concealment, making it nearly invisible in low light. He crawled back to American lines and said nothing to anyone. If an officer discovered what he'd done, he'd face disciplinary action. If it worked, it might reduce further losses. If it failed, he'd likely have revealed American positions for nothing. The wire waited, taut and hidden across the empty road. March 12, 1944, began with heavy fog. Visibility was poor, which typically meant German patrols would delay their reconnaissance runs. But at 6:43 a.m., Dalton heard the distinctive sound of a scout car engine approaching from the north. He was in a forward observation position, eating cold rations. He didn't alert anyone else initially. There was nothing they could do anyway, and calling attention to the wire would require explanations he couldn't provide. The 222 emerged from the fog at roughly 600 yards, moving at moderate speed, perhaps 15 miles per hour. The commander's hatch was open, standard procedure for reconnaissance runs where visibility mattered more than protection. Dalton watched the vehicle approach his improvised obstacle. 500 yards, 400, 300. The car stayed centered on the road, exactly where it needed to be. At approximately 6:47 a.m., the scout car's front right wheel struck the wire. The effect was immediate. The wheel caught and locked. The axle seized. But the vehicle's momentum, over 3,000 pounds moving at 22 feet per second, couldn't stop instantly. The locked wheel became a pivot point. The car's nose dipped sharply. The rear lifted. The entire vehicle went vertical, then continued rotating. The vehicle lost control, overturned multiple times, and came to rest upside down. The noise brought American soldiers out of their positions. Dalton was already moving toward the wreck, calling for assistance from nearby soldiers. The scout car's engine was still running, wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The crash disabled the vehicle and immediately ended the patrol. The crew was unable to continue operations, and the wreck was secured by nearby American soldiers. Within minutes, more American soldiers arrived. Officers began examining the wreck, looking for what had caused the crash. They found no mine craters, no explosive damage, no rocket impacts. The car had lost control. Apparently, after hitting something in the road, Dalton quietly removed the wire from the axle while others were focused on securing the prisoner and checking the vehicle for documents. He coiled it up and buried it in his pack before anyone could examine it closely. When questioned, he stated simply that the car must have struck an obstacle. Given the fog and poor visibility, this explanation was accepted. Word spread through the company within hours, though not through official channels. Soldiers talked among themselves, comparing notes, asking questions. A scout car had crashed, but nobody could explain exactly how. One soldier had noticed wire in Dalton's equipment. Another had seen him working near that section of road 2 nights earlier. The pieces came together through the informal communication network that exists in every military unit. The conversations that happen after officers go to sleep, the whispered exchanges during guard duty. Within 3 days, 2 other soldiers had approached Dalton privately. They wanted to know the method. Dalton initially refused, but then another scout car patrol stopped a soldier in a neighboring platoon. He reconsidered. He showed them the technique: shovel placement, wire height, tension requirements, concealment methods. He emphasized the critical measurements: 14 inches off the ground, 18 feet across, tension tight enough. Those 2 soldiers set up their own traps along other roads the Germans used. They told no one officially, but they mentioned it to soldiers they trusted. By mid-March, 6 men knew the method. By late March, a dozen. Each installation was unauthorized. None were documented. The soldiers simply implemented the solution because it worked and because losses continued without an effective solution. On March 18th, another 222 hit one of these improvised obstacles. Same result. The patrol was unable to continue its mission, and the soldier who'd set the trap removed the wire before investigators could identify the cause. German reconnaissance units began noticing a pattern. Over the following weeks, similar mechanical incidents occurred along the same patrol routes. Patrols became more cautious. Speeds decreased. Commanders started dismounting to inspect suspicious sections of road before proceeding. The caution reduced their effectiveness significantly. Slower patrols covered less ground and provided less timely intelligence. Artillery strikes called in by reconnaissance units declined noticeably. In early April, a company commander conducting a routine inspection discovered one of his soldiers installing a wire obstacle across a road. The officer recognized what he was seeing and demanded an explanation. The soldier admitted learning the technique from others in the unit. The captain made him demonstrate the entire process while taking detailed notes, measurements, materials, installation procedures, all of it. Then came the decision that would determine whether this innovation spread or died. The captain could enforce regulations and shut down an unauthorized practice, or he could recognize that the method was working and quietly allow it to continue. He chose documentation over enforcement. He compiled a technical report describing the wire obstacle method, including success rates and casualty reductions. He noted that reconnaissance attacks had dropped by over 60% in sectors where soldiers had implemented this approach. He submitted the report to battalion headquarters on April 12th. The official response arrived within a week. Method: unauthorized, discontinue immediately, violates field manual regulations. The captain filed the directive and did nothing. The wire obstacles remained in place. No orders were issued to remove them. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, losses were being reduced. Higher headquarters eventually noticed the statistical anomaly. Casualty reports showed a dramatic decline in reconnaissance-related losses over the following months, particularly in sectors where the method was in use. Intelligence officers investigated and found the wire obstacles within days. Their response was pragmatic bureaucracy at its finest. They issued no orders stopping the practice, but they also didn't officially approve it. The method existed in a gray area, tolerated but not endorsed, effective but not authorized. In late May 1944, the 34th Infantry Division was pulled off the line for rest and reconstitution. They were to be replaced by the 36th Infantry Division, fresh troops who would inherit the same terrain and face the same reconnaissance problem. A division staff officer recognized that the incoming unit needed this knowledge. However, officially documenting or teaching an unauthorized method was impossible. The solution was administrative creativity. Dalton was assigned to a training detail focused on improvised obstacle placement. The official paperwork described techniques for creating hasty defensive obstacles using materials at hand. What was actually taught was the specific method for disabling scout cars with wire. Over 2 weeks in June, Dalton trained approximately 60 soldiers from the 36th Division. He demonstrated placement techniques, explained the critical measurements, showed photographs of disabled vehicles, and provided casualty statistics comparing units that used the method versus those that didn't. The soldiers were skeptical initially. The concept seemed too simple to work against armored vehicles, but the evidence was undeniable. Scout cars that encountered properly installed wire obstacles were reliably disabled. By July, the method had spread to 3 divisions. By August, it was in use across much of the Italian front. It never appeared in training manuals or official doctrine, but it was transmitted through something more effective: direct, soldier-to-soldier instruction based on proven battlefield results. German reconnaissance units operating in Italy during the summer of 1944 noticed the problem but struggled to understand its cause. Multiple scout cars had crashed in circumstances that defied explanation. There were no mine craters, no evidence of anti-tank weapons, just vehicles that inexplicably lost control on apparently clear roads. A reconnaissance platoon leader eventually examined the wreckage of a destroyed 222 carefully enough to find evidence of an unseen obstacle in the wheel housing. The damage pattern suggested something had caught the front axle at speed, something thin, strong, and deliberately placed. German intelligence attempted to gather information through prisoner interrogations, but captured American soldiers genuinely knew nothing about the practice. It wasn't documented anywhere the Germans could capture, and most soldiers using the method had learned it informally, without knowing its origin. The German solution was to issue warnings and modify patrol procedures. Scout car crews were instructed to approach suspicious road sections cautiously, to scan for wire obstacles, and to reduce speed when visibility was limited. These measures reduced crashes but also degraded reconnaissance effectiveness. Slower, more cautious patrols provided less timely intelligence and covered smaller areas. The tactical advantage that German reconnaissance had enjoyed early in 1944 diminished significantly by summer. After the war, military analysts examining German reconnaissance losses noted an unexplained increase in vehicle crashes during the Italian campaign. The pattern was specific to certain sectors and certain time periods, exactly where and when American infantry had been using wire obstacles. Army engineers eventually validated the concept through controlled testing. Wire obstacles at axle height, properly tensioned and anchored, could indeed disable light reconnaissance vehicles by exploiting their center of gravity and forward momentum. The physics were sound. In 1949, the technique was formally incorporated into U.S. Army Doctrine as an approved method for countering light armored vehicles. The training manual credited the innovation to field observations during the Italian campaign without naming individuals. The method became part of standard combat engineering curriculum. Modern variations of the technique are still taught, adapted for contemporary vehicles and materials, but based on the same fundamental principle. A properly placed obstacle can use a vehicle's own momentum against it. James Dalton was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of sergeant. He received a combat infantryman badge for service in Italy, but no decoration specifically related to the wire obstacle method. The Army preferred not to formally recognize an innovation that had begun as a violation of standing orders. He returned to Gary, Indiana, and resumed work at the rail yards, where he'd learned the mechanical intuition that had served him so well during the war. He married, raised 3 children, and worked for U.S. Steel for 41 years. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. When asked, he would say only that he'd done his job and come home. Once a year on March 12th, he received phone calls from other veterans who'd been in Italy, men who remembered the scout cars and the wire and the difference it had made. In 1963, a military historian researching the Italian campaign tracked down Dalton through other veterans and requested an interview. Dalton agreed to one conversation. He provided technical details and confirmed dates, then asked that his name not be published. The historian respected that request. James Dalton died in 1987. His obituary mentioned his military service and his 4 decades at U.S. Steel. The story of Dalton's wire obstacle illustrates a fundamental truth about military innovation. The most effective solutions often come from soldiers facing immediate problems, not from committees developing theoretical doctrine. Dalton saw losses continue because official methods required equipment that didn't exist. He applied skills learned in civilian life to create a solution using materials already available. When that solution worked, other soldiers adopted it despite official prohibition. Eventually, the institution acknowledged reality and incorporated the field innovation into formal doctrine. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. Soldiers facing combat develop practical solutions that violate regulations but reduce losses. Those solutions spread through informal networks until institutional resistance becomes untenable. Finally, the innovation is codified and credited to field observations rather than to individuals who risked punishment to implement them. The wire obstacle method contributed to a substantial reduction in American casualties during 1944. It degraded German reconnaissance capability across an entire theater of operations. It accomplished all this using existing materials and requiring no special training beyond what one corporal could teach in an evening. Yet the man who invented it returned to a railroad yard and never sought recognition. Perhaps that's appropriate. The soldiers who used his method and survived didn't need formal acknowledgement to understand what he'd given them. Sometimes the most important innovations leave the smallest official footprints, and sometimes that's exactly how the innovators prefer it.